Good evening from our headquarters in Kyiv. This is the Sunday show on Hromadske International, the only primetime TV program explaining the Eastern European geopolitical storm in English, and I'm Natalia Humenuk. And tonight on the Sunday show. "3,500 participants. Highlights from this year's Kyiv Pride. Syria and Ukraine. Both countries are suffering from Russian intervention. We'll look at how the situation are similar and how they are different. Author and Pulitzer Prize winner Anne Applebaum talks Holodomor, Russia destabilizing role in Europe and changing global politics. What is competitive authoritarianism and does it exist in Ukraine? We talk to author and professor Lucan Way. Daily life for Ukraine's LGBT community often involves discrimination and even human rights violation. One event hoping to one day put the end to that is Kyiv Pride, which has taken place annually for the last 4 years. This year's Pride kicked off a week ago and featured a program of lectures, seminars and film screening aimed at raising awareness of LGBT rights and issues. Kyiv Pride culminated today with an equality march through the streets of the Ukrainian capital, attended by around 3,500 people. This year was one of the most peaceful and biggest marches in the event's history. With us in the studio to discuss how this year's Pride went are two members of the organization committee and also LGBT activist and executive director Ruslana Panukhnik and PR head Timur Levchuk. But before Hromadske visited Kyiv Pride, let's take a look at how it unfolded.
Bright posters, foreign diplomats and a drag queen stage. All this featured in Kyiv's Equality March. Around 3,500 people participated in Kyiv Pride, although the organizers expected at least 5,000. Clashes between opponents of the march and police started at 6 a.m. Around 150 opponents of the procession tried to block the movement along its route. And when the police dispersed the protesters, they used tear gas. Police used tear gas when dispersing the protesters. 57 people were detained and 3 law enforcement officers were injured. But Kyiv Pride 2018 itself was quite peaceful. This was even noted by German Minister of Europe, Michael Roth.
I'm really honored to join so many demonstrators, and it was a very peaceful and happy demonstration with a clear commitment to equality and solidarity.
Nearly 5,000 law enforcement officers oversaw the march in Kyiv city center. Member of the European Parliament Rebecca Harms joined the Equality March, as well as Canadian Ambassador to Ukraine, Roman Waschuk, and U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine, Mary Yovanovich.
It's great to be out here with so many Ukrainians supporting the right for everybody to be treated with dignity and respect.
Among the participants of the Equality March were the Ukrainian MPs Serhiy Lyshchenko and Svetlana Zalishchuk. March participants reached the finishing point with no problems, where they were taken to safe places by bus.
So that was the day, very long, started very early. So what are the main highlights? And also, that was the most peaceful march for the last years. But at the same time, still somebody remarked that it's still more a political march rather than a celebration.
It is, because we still are marching in the surroundings of the thousands of the police officers and law enforcement officers, and we still do not have the full openness of the march. So we still have to go through the check-in points and to the security check in order to march in the city center. So yeah, there is some steps to go further, and I guess I would say that our estimations and the numbers are kind of bigger, because as far as I know that police slightly decrease the numbers from year to year, and our estimations are 5,000 people. And we were counting them, our volunteers were counting people.
But also it's first year when we have really support from celebrities, from Ukrainian celebrities. I mean about Ukrainian song Irina Bilyk, the Anja.
Pop stars.
Yes, really pop stars. And also TV producer and video producer Alan Badoyev, Max Barskih, and something else. But it's really huge support from celebrities, and it's first time in our history.
Oh, what was different when with dealing the city, with dealing with the police this year?
This year we continued our very fruitful and successful and very pleasant cooperation with police and city authorities, because starting from 2016 we have the full support from the city and from the police in order to guarantee the security and to protect the public order within the march itself. And we do have the very good cooperation. We start like half a year before. We had like several meetings, and everything went very smooth and well. And we do very satisfied with that.
At the same time, there are usually, at least after the march, sometimes there would be some, attacks on some of the activists. How about this year?
We haven't any news about this. Some post on Facebook, but it's not case, and we haven't any case.
Actually, we have two cases during this year's March of Equality. The one happened before the march. One of our volunteers was attacked before the march with the pepper spray gas, and the one case happened afterwards with the same pepper spray gas attack. So nobody was hit or beaten or attacked heavily. So only the gas attack. I guess I would consider it a good result after the march. So nobody was hurt and nobody was beaten up afterwards.
I would also like to draw the attention to another our report, which is more about the logistic of the march and also of the commands of the participants.
From 9 o'clock in the morning, the center of Kyiv was busy. The annual March for Equality and LGBT Rights, Kyiv Pride, started near the National Opera building. On the other side of the fence stood counter-protesters who had tried blocking the territory of Kyiv Pride earlier in the morning, but were prevented by police. 57 people were detained today.
I don't understand why some kind of radical group can dictate how we should live, who we should love, what we should demand from the government, and so on. Today they're demanding this from the LGBT community. Tomorrow they're going to be demanding it from the Jews, and we're going to be back to the Second World War, just the way it was.
Everyone who wanted to attend the march had to be checked by the police. They checked through everyone's bags and made sure no suspicious-looking people got in. As a result of these checks, lines were formed. Every year, thousands of people attend Kyiv Pride, despite the threat of attacks.
You know when you have values, you're not afraid to die for them, but it's only scary when you sit and stay silent, afraid. I can tell you that in the sphere of HIV/AIDS, if people had been afraid, we would not have had therapy. We would have all died. In reality, it's the same here. We need to go out and speak. Fear does not belong here. We need to show people, those who are afraid, that they can finally accept themselves, because we're also standing up for them.
Participants in the march brought rainbow flags and Ukrainian flags. Later on, drag queens arrived. At the Kyiv Pride territory, volunteers helped the participants form an orderly column. The march started at 10 a.m. In total, the participants walked around 1.5 kilometers. Police were guarding both sides of the column, but despite that, some disturbers of the march managed to break through the cordon of guards. There were no other provocations during the march.
Yes, things are changing. What's changed is that this year my mother helped me get ready for Pride. The attitude has changed. Although, still, when I was going to the metro, I saw a man who was on his phone saying, "What is this gay parade really today?" I always see that there isn't a clear line between Pride and a parade. There is a lot of indignation over the fact that the public wasn't able to get to the metro station they were trying to get to. In a sense, comfort takes first place. No one wants to figure out why people are here, what they want, and so on. In reality, what people here want concerns absolutely everyone, regardless of their sexual orientation or gender identity. This is something that every country needs, even those people who weren't able to get to their metro station.
So in the end, the participants of the march were grateful to the police. They were chanting. But this year there were a lot of criticism by some other people that it's a bit overdone. Too much kind of security. Since yesterday, the center of the city is shut down, and that kind of provokes the critique. So what would you say? Could it be handled differently, that it gives like more feeling of the freedom rather than the, again, a secured cage?
This is the challenge for the Kyiv Pride, I guess, for the last 3 years when we are marching the city center, because I do understand that police at some point overprotect, overdo some security measures, but I do trust them on their choices and their choices of the security measures regarding Kyiv Pride, because as I already mentioned, we do have the very good cooperation and understanding one of each other, and I guess these were the needed, necessary measures to do this year.
And Timur, do you feel that the protest mood against the Pride is growing? So beside the far rights this year, there were more marches, smaller, but let's say from the conservative groups like traditional family values, and they are also more heard. Some kind of heard in the public sphere, at least like from the other TV channels in Ukraine. The discussion is definitely, there is bigger discussion. So what would you say? Is it in generally this controversy over LGBT is growing in the society and discussion is harsher?
So I think LGBT community more visible in Ukraine now, and of course our opponents more active and more visible too. And I think it's a really normal process in our country and other countries. But I think really important understanding that our community more power, more visible, and we can see on the Pride about 5,000 persons, but we can't see our opponents. It's like about 100 or 200 people. So.
At the same time, there were 2 MPs, at least that's what we clearly know, Sergei Leshchenko and Svetlana Zalishuk, who've been there for 4 years. But we haven't seen way more. We have Euro-optimists, we have a lot of other people, we have 450 MPs. I've seen some of the junior members of different cabinets. I haven't seen, I could be mistaken, but I have met a German minister for Europe, but I haven't met any Ukrainian minister. So how it's going with that? Were they invited? How this communication is going on? Because I find it symbolic.
Actually, there were 3 MPs in the march. Yeah, we discovered that after the march, that there were like Alexei Mushak as well. So, but yeah, this is the challenge for Kyiv Pride as well. We're trying to engage as many decision makers and like role models for the people to participate in the Pride. But I guess these kind of this small number of people, of MPs and other like politicians participate in this Pride, I would say was connected to the next elections, next year's elections, and I guess they were more reluctant to do that in order to secure their electorate and etc.
And if we summarize, beside the Prides, what is the next goal? What probably would be the issue, the one issue to solve for the LGBT community in Ukraine?
More participants, I think.
And besides the Prides, on the everyday, regarding their everyday life?
I would say the maximum implementation of the Human Rights Strategy 2020, which includes as well the draft on these same-sex partnerships as well, and also the legislations on hate crimes prosecution and the anti-discrimination legislation, and of course the educational work and the other informational work in order to educate people and to bring more information in order to make to do they are more tolerant and more acceptant to the LGBT community. And maybe they will join the march next year.
So thanks a lot. You definitely deserve good rest. And I should say that Ukraine also marks Father's Day today. By the way, both the Ukrainian president and the Ukrainian prime minister, first of all, today congratulated the country with this event, not mentioning the Pride, at least that's what we have heard. So, but how willing are Ukrainian fathers to speak about the LGBT to their kids? We went to find out.
The thing that probably scares me the most is if my child does something that goes against my values. But this is a fear that every parent has. It's just that set of values is different for everyone. So for instance, if the child carries out a violent act, if the child takes part in one of those Roma camp dismantlements that have been happening this year, how many were there? Like 4 or 5? That would scare me and baffle me. It would make me think, what did I do wrong to make my child pursue this path of hatred and violence?
You can't just turn gay overnight. Maybe you can realize it one day that you had relationships with the opposite sex and you didn't like it. You can discover this one day. But then, on the other hand, if you're close with your child, how can you fail to notice it? How can you not notice that your son's relationships with girls are not working out, that they're forced or just based on friendship? But with boys, on the other hand, they're always really warm. I think it's just impossible not to notice if you're close with a person.
I think it's important to understand here, a child can come to you in 2 different cases. It can be a problem that you need to help them solve, or it can be a decision that the child has already taken. Even this hypothetical, "Hi Dad, I'm gay," in principle, it can happen when the child is 12, 14 or 15 years old. But before this, it'd be just, "Dad, I like collecting postage stamps," or "Dad, I like board games." But those are just small aspects of a whole human being whom you probably know better than anyone else. So, of course, it's their decision. You just have to accept and support them. But if it's a problem, you, of course, need to talk about it. And if the level of trust between you is high enough, you need to try and solve this problem, which can be something like that other people don't accept him or her, since our society is quite prejudiced in this regard. And unfortunately, it can be quite dangerous too.
My son is not only homosexual, but an LGBTI activist too, and it's been a long time since he came out. He came out to me 3 years ago, but I was calm about it because I always understood the complexity of human nature. He invited me over to his place. I'm from Lviv, so I used to live there on a permanent basis, to introduce me to his partner. I was worried how it all would go, how I would take it, whether I'd act constrained and prejudiced, whether I would feel anxiety, stress, or even sorrow, but it was completely the opposite.
I don't treat sexual orientation as a separate thing. People have different preferences and that's normal. If they are to ask me about it, I will explain.
In my opinion, I'm not sure my elder child sees it as different, because whenever we talk about these things, we explain it in general terms, as in two people are together, sometimes they can have children, sometimes they can't.
Would you go to Kyiv Pride with your children?
I'm not sure I'd bring my child there, because throughout its history this event hasn't been completely safe.
No, I wouldn't go. If my wife wants to go, she's free to do it and take the children with her.
I will go, and I have been wanting to go these last 3 months. I told my son Zoryan this. I want to walk hand in hand with him and his partner, because for me, Pride is not just a celebration by this community, and it's actually far from a celebration. It's self-expression and a declaration of your rights. And I support a universal application of universal laws and rules to all and everyone, and I'm against discrimination. This Pride is against oppression and discrimination.
In 2014, Russia encroached on Ukrainian territory with its legal annexation of Crimea and support for militant separatists in the Ukrainian Donbas. Then, in September 2015, Russia officially acknowledged that it sent troops into Syria in support of the Assad regime. However, we should remember that Russia had strong military presence in Syria even before and had been training the governmental troops together with Iran since 2011, the start of the war. Although Ukraine and Syria may seem like worlds apart, they face a common threat. On June 18th, English-language newspaper Kyiv Post is hosting a conference focusing some of the themes that tie these two countries together, including war and territorial loss. So we have with us Brian Bonner, who is the editor-in-chief of the Kyiv Post, and Vail Alegi, who is the spokesperson from Syrian Network for Human Rights from London. So first of all, thanks a lot for being with us and good evening. And Brian, we clearly understand the first reason. The new publisher of Kyiv Post is Syrian himself, living in Ukraine, so that's his initiative to have that, what I understand, correct me if I'm wrong, but what is the main idea behind that?
Natalia, thanks a lot for having us. You're right, it wasn't my idea, it was Adnan Kivan, the new publisher of the Kyiv Post since March 21st. We've been here talking about him before, and it was a good idea. He's from Syria. He hasn't been there since 1983. He's anti-Assad, and he's a businessman who had a success in Odessa. What we hope to get out of this is to build alliances, build friendships, build understandings, because as different as the two situations are, and as different as the nations are, and the scale of the tragedy and the complexity, there are a lot of things in common. We have the Russian intervention. Without Russia, there is no war in Ukraine. Without Russia, the situation is less complicated and there are more chances for peace in Syria. Russia is playing a destructive role in both countries, helping to dismember both countries, wants to stay in both countries, has been indiscriminately bombing, including civilians, creating a refugee crisis. The aims are the same, is to weaken the West, both in Ukraine, Western oriented, and also to weaken the West by creating a refugee crisis. Now, they've used a lot of the same tactics. They've used the paramilitary groups, the Wagner group started in the Donbas and moved to Syria. They've also disinformation campaigns that are being used in Syria today will be very familiar to Russia. So the deeper, it will be very familiar to Ukrainians. So the deeper you look, there are similarities, and this is a first of its kind conference. We're bringing in Syrians, Ukrainians, international experts on Syria. We hope it is just the first of many until we see these wars end. 7 years now in Syria, and we're in the 5th year now in Ukraine.
And so what are the things you think that the Ukrainians should know and the people here on the war in Syria? Something which goes beyond the usual international headlines, which is more about geopolitics.
Well, the aim of the conference, as Brian said, is to educate the public and to raise awareness and to talk with policy makers and decision makers about what has been happening in Syria and about the destructive role that Russia is playing in Syria. The relationship between Assad's regime and Russia goes way before the conflict or the uprising in 2011. Now, since 2011, Russia has maintained a position in which supporting a brutal and sectarian regime, a regime that has been killing its own people using chemical weapons, using ballistic missiles, using barrel bombs, a regime that destroyed most of Syria now. So Russia is a destabilizing force in Syria, and the situation in Syria, and because of the Russian intervention, is affecting the neighboring countries in Syria, in the Middle East, and threatening international peace and the stability in the Middle East.
And we definitely share the idea of solidarity between the Ukrainians and Syrians who suffer from the war. At the same time, what are your concerns and on really comparing those very different wars? Because, you know, Ukrainians are very concerned about using the term of the civil war because it's an artificial conflict which we call the war against Ukraine. At the same time, clearly, we know that it's an inner conflict in Syria. It wasn't brought from abroad in the beginning. Also, the level of devastation is definitely different. 500,000 people almost dead in Syria, 10,000 in Ukraine. At the same time, the use of air force, which is fortunately for Ukraine, isn't there. So somehow there are some things which probably, and also the whole part of the jihadist movement of ISIS, of the terrorist threat, which is indeed, and also other regional partners from Turkey to Saudi Arabia and Iran. So this is a complex issues, but what are also the concerns we should understand that these are the things in common, but there, of course, we can't really consider that there should be the same solutions or same things discussed.
Yeah, absolutely. Would you like? Yeah, there are similarities and there are differences. I didn't get your question, sorry.
No, my idea is that there would be some concerns if you like, for instance, for Ukrainians would be concerning to use the kind of the term of the civil war to compare the Ukrainian war to Syrian.
The nature of the conflict in Ukraine is different from the nature of the conflict in Syria. In Syria, there was a popular uprising against a sectarian and brutal regime. The regime retaliated in extreme force, which caused the situation to escalate. And later on, regional powers and non-state players interfered in the conflict, and we are where we are now. The situation in Ukraine is quite different. It was a direct invasion by Russia and its militia and allies. In Syria, the Russian intervention was in agreement with Assad's regime, so it wasn't a direct invasion. In fact, in reality, it is an invasion. Russia has been using its air force to bomb residential areas and civil facilities indiscriminately, causing thousands of casualties, causing massive destruction. This didn't happen nationwide. So the Russians have been bombing almost everywhere in Syria. This didn't happen in Ukraine. Now, in terms of the political solution, I think the mechanisms are different and geopolitics are different and the international mood is different. Russia is in Ukraine probably to stay for a long time. They are there to stay in Syria, but probably they are more willing to discuss an exit or a political solution. So that's how I see it, really.
And Brian, do we know more on particularly the same things which are used in the both wars? For instance, like you mentioned, the Wagner group, the group of the mercenaries who are fighting in Syria now and were involved in the Donbas, and to what extent we really, in Ukraine, you think we understand what's going on there?
Well, I had to get up to speed on the Syrian situation, that's for sure. And you're right, people gave us strange looks at the beginning. Why are you comparing this? Ukraine is not a civil war, Syria is a civil war. Well, yes, we understand that and we know that. But to give you an example, just reading some news reports today, Assad has said, and it's part of the Russian propaganda machine, that the West is going to use chemical weapons as a provocation to blame it on Assad. How familiar does that sound? I mean, well, where Ukraine, the victim, is portrayed as the aggressor in Russian propaganda. And this is from the same nation that's been blocking United Nations Security Council resolutions in both nations, which could be helpful to resolving the both wars. Obviously, Russia is playing an obstructionist role, a destructive role, and an evil role in both countries.
What also interesting that what we know from this year, there was the Yalta conference in the occupied Crimea run by Russia, and there were the senior officials from the Syrian regime there, quite a few, because of course they would be outcast in some of the countries. We knew that some of the Assad kids were in the Artak camp, which is a bit exotic. I would use this word. It sounds a bit exotic. But really, what are the new developments in Russian-Syrian relations? If we speak besides Russian military being present, having their military base.
Well, the Russian military presence in Syria is substantial and it's getting bigger. And in terms of Syrian politics, it seems that the main and the biggest decision maker in Syria is Putin, not Assad.
And not Tehran?
To a lesser extent.
To a lesser extent.
To a lesser extent, yeah? Yes. Obviously, the Iranians have their own objectives, which are not necessarily in line with the Russian policy in Syria. And in some places, there is a conflict of interest. So there is some sort of tension between Iran and Russia in Syria regarding certain issues, but ultimately the big boss is Russia, not Iran, and certainly not Assad, who is technically a puppet for President Putin now.
And what we can say about a possible involvement of the West? That probably you're trying to raise not just solidarity between Syrians and Ukrainians, but the international attention to that. Any way that somehow the issues of the Ukraine and Russia and Syria and Russia could be dealt by the same people in the same terms, because sometimes it's even sometimes it might be tricky. We understand that France has in some of the positions the West would like to cooperate with Russia on fighting the terrorism in the Middle East. So somehow it's not that bad that sometimes those issues are separated.
I think we want to look out of our situation and out of the Syrian situation. And when you look at Russia's role, we want to show the world that actually the aims are quite similar in both cases, and the target is really the West. The ultimate target is the West. Vastly more complicated. Imagine if in this war we had not only Russia invasion, but we had Belarus, Poland, Romania, Hungary. I mean, you'd have a complicated set of actors. But if you look at the situation, there are some of the same players involved. And if we can get them online, because clearly the United Nations Security Council is not working because Russia is able to veto everything, including any accountability for chemical weapons, for bombing civilian areas, and so forth. But if you look at Germany, they play a huge role in the peace process in Ukraine. If you look at Germany's role in Syria, well, when Obama did not draw the red line on chemical weapons, Putin came in. And at that time, Assad was very weak, and he strengthened Putin. And at the same time, Angela Merkel in Germany said, we will take up to 1 million refugees. Well, Putin created those million refugees, and now Germany that refugee crisis has altered the political landscape. As you know, Germany is going through domestic political crisis because of this. And Germany is also one of the biggest donors to Syrian refugee issues. So if you get Germany and the big players involved, and hopefully get America re-engaged somehow, and Turkey, you can start to see how the situation could get better. But unfortunately, I don't think anybody who I've talked to in both wars sees an end very quickly.
What is also interesting is the way how Russia is perceived in the Arab world, because of course previously, before this war, there was a pretty huge support. Traditionally, there was a support to Russia. You know, it's a part of the anti-Americanism which is there. But of course, the Syria, the Russian involvement forced a huge part of the Arabs to be very concerned about what's going on. But my question would be rather to say to our audience, because our Eastern European experts are becoming the experts also on Syria now, what are the most important issues to understand? Because after Aleppo, we understand that still the opposition to the Syrian regime lost a lot of territory. So there is just a chunk territory in around Idlib. So more or less, doesn't matter that there is no easy solution now. It looks like the Russia and the Assad regime is winning, is clearly winning, and the opposition is losing the physical ground and, you know, first of all, the ground.
Well, yes, you are right. They are winning militarily. They are gaining more territory, but these territories are completely destroyed. The society is completely crushed and divided. So, you know, I don't know if we can call it a victory. Yes, a victory for them because they are sick. They are mentally and psychologically and emotionally unstable. They are ruthless criminals. They inflicted that destruction. But again, where do we go from here after the military victory? Where do we go from here? What about reconstruction? What about reconciliation? Because the Syrian society is hugely divided now along ethnic lines and sectarian lines. There is the Arab-Kurdish division. There is the Sunni Alawite division, let's put it like that, so frankly. So where do we go from that? Those who perpetrated those crimes cannot be part or cannot be the moderators or the facilitators. It doesn't work.
And I mean, far from a Syrian expert, which is another reason why I'm going to learn a lot at this conference, but I mean, I understand from experts I talked to that Assad's hold on territory, even in his so-called control, is not that strong. There are areas where Kurds and opposition dominate. The other thing, you know, again, goes back to Russia. They're better at destruction than reconstruction. Who's going to rebuild Donbass after they've destroyed it? Who's going to rebuild Syria after they've destroyed it? If they're counting on the West, it would take a big change in policy, because the European Union policy is we're not going to help reconstructing Syria until there's a political change. And for some, that means Assad has to go. Now, it's so unfortunate, and this is another reason to tie the two together. If we see the Russian aims in Ukraine as similar to in Syria and aimed at the West, then maybe the West will have a change of heart in doing business as usual. I mean, again, go back to Germany. Despite its involvement in the peace process here in Ukraine, despite its generosity in accepting refugees from Syria, despite its generosity in giving money to help refugees in Syria, it still gave a green light to doing business as usual with Russia through Nord Stream 2. This has got to end if Putin doesn't change his policies.
So there are way more topics, from disinformation to the actual use of weapons, but we have, and you have, the full conference to discuss this Monday. So wish you the fruitful discussion and your knowledge, and thanks for being with us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And I would encourage you to watch the full version of all our stories and our web page. Also sign up for our newsletter if you would like to receive Hromadske International weekly highlights. The sign up box is on the upper right hand side of the site. Also follow us on Twitter and Facebook, search Hromadske International, and I'll be back in a second. Author Anne Applebaum's back catalogue features a range of award-winning work exploring some of the most crucial moments from Soviet and Eastern European history. Her most recent work, Red Famine, Stalin's War in Ukraine, examines the Soviet man-made famine of the early 1930s and the devastation it left in Ukraine. Hromadske caught up with the Washington Post columnist and Pulitzer winner at the launch of the Ukrainian version of Red Famine to talk about reception of her book globally, as well as current events in the United States, Europe, and around Ukraine. Let's take a look.
In the Western world, I was expecting a much stronger reaction against the book. I thought people would say, this can't be true, and you haven't proved it, and so on. And actually, I really have had a very positive reaction. I think it's partly because, first of all, I think the book is based on a lot of research that people recognize as real and is well done, mostly Ukrainian research done by Ukrainian historians. I also think the fact that Ukraine is now a state with its own, a president and its own army, and it's defending itself, and it's part of the world conversation, and it has its own historians and its own archivists who are able to speak in public. The history of Ukraine is perceived differently than it used to be. So instead of this kind of mythological country, and we don't really know where it is, and maybe this is true and maybe it isn't, people now have the sense that, this is a Ukrainian state and it has its own archives, and this book comes from work done in those archives. And I think it's had a very positive reception, but part of the reception has been shaped by an understanding of contemporary Ukraine, which is better understood now than it used to be.
Do you think there is a kind of a single or common narrative? I mean, people perceiving that there is Ukrainian history of the 20th century, from Holodomor to Russian aggression, and this kind of the same picture.
So I didn't write the book for that reason. It wasn't my intention to show that the Holodomor is part of this longer chain of history, but yes, I think it does look that way. And of course, I started the book started the book in 2012 when Yanukovych was president, so the book wasn't intended to be part of Ukrainian politics. But of course, when you write about Stalin in Ukraine and how Stalin perceived Ukraine as a threat, then pretty quickly you begin to understand, yes, and this is how Putin also sees Ukraine as a threat, as a kind of ideological threat. And so it's hard not to see this link to the past.
It's about today's events, and in this sense about unity, both in Europe and about transatlantic unity. I mean, what is very difficult for us Ukrainians right now is this divide between US and Europe, and we see this clash going wider and wider on Iran primarily. We see Macron going to Kremlin. How do you perceive that?
Look, we have the first US president since World War II who does not feel personally invested in or part of the transatlantic alliance. It's more than, Obama was also much more oriented to Asia and so on than previous presidents. But this is a president who actually is hostile to the alliance. And he's, in the years before he became president, in his books and so on, he said that many times. He doesn't like allies. He doesn't see why U.S. troops are in Europe. He's written these things many times. And that is a big change. We've never had that before. And so I would say this split is mostly to do with Trump and the way he sees the world. He understands diplomacy as a kind of zero-sum game by which we win. If we win, you lose. Whereas historically, the transatlantic alliance has been, together we cooperate and we both win. And we create this trading system that's good for both of us, and we create this alliance that's good for both of us. And Trump he can't somehow see the world that way.
Let's come back to Russia. I cannot avoid the question of Kremlin prisoners. We see the hashtag behind Free Sentsov. It's kind of a wave in Ukraine, but it seems to me that this issue is underestimated in the West, and
probably.
World Cup is going to happen like as if nothing happens. How do you see it?
Well, the World Cup is going to happen. You know, we had the Olympics in China, and there were Chinese political prisoners, so it's not like this is unprecedented. You know, I think it's a good moment for Ukrainians to talk about this, actually. I mean, I don't know what will happen. It's possible the World Cup could be canceled for all kinds of reasons. I can still imagine. But if it's not, this is a useful moment for Ukrainians to speak about it, for protests to be organized, for the attention of international journalists to be drawn to this. I mean, I would make use of it. I mean, it might be quite a useful moment for Ukraine.
But generally, we feel in Ukraine that Russia comes from a strategy of direct, invasion to a strategy of kind of a subversion, of putting chaos and destabilizing country from within. Do you have that feeling with regard to Europe, US, maybe?
Yes, I mean, we now see this is not really a secret anymore. Russia does not want to go to war with the West. I actually don't believe Russia wants to invade Estonia, or even invade Ukraine much farther for the moment. It's very expensive to invade. People die. There's a backlash. They don't want that. What they want to do is to undermine Europe from within. And they have a different strategy for each country. In some countries, like in Italy, they have open relationships with the political parties. They have an open relationship with the Northern League, which is one of the I don't know who's running Italy right now. As we're filming this right now, Italy has no government, so it's hard to say. But they have an open relationship with Marine Le Pen in France, and and with the AfD in Germany, the Alternative for Deutschland in Germany. And so they have some open relationships. They also have some clandestine relationships with business people. They have some corrupt relationships. And in addition to that, they have a policy of attacking and undermining journalists, and particularly Russians abroad, as a way of sending messages. Don't follow this person. Don't become a Russian opposition journalist. Don't work in Kyiv. Don't defect to London. And this is their way this is partly about their own people rather than foreign policy. But it's also partly a way of showing, look, we can do anything anywhere. We can kill anyone anywhere. We can do whatever we want. It's supposed to make people frightened.
Still in 2001, authors Lucan Way and Stephen Levitsky coined the term competitive authoritarianism to describe regimes which are democratic in appearance but more authoritarian in reality. This could be said of Ukraine under President Leonid Kuchma and later under Viktor Yanukovych. But what about today? I sat down with Associate Professor at the University of Toronto, Lucan Way himself, to discuss where competitive authoritarianism exists today and what Ukraine needs to do to avoid this label in the future, as well if there are any chances that the United States may experience that.
Today, it's much more competitive and democratic than it was under Yanukovych. I mean, you don't have major opposition leaders in jail, for example. Nonetheless, I think I'm actually quite troubled by some of the developments recently under Poroshenko. I mean, I think you see sort of old-style abuses, such as attacks on NGOs. I think the sort of effort to take away the citizenship of Saakashvili was a kind of classic autocratic move. That's sort of familiar to in many autocracies and competitive authoritarian regimes in the world. But you also see kind of what's interesting is kind of new forms of abuse that didn't exist in Ukraine. Some are a product of the war, right? You have the banning of the Communist Party as a result of the decommunization law. I mean, this is something novel in many ways, and most competitive authoritarian regimes in the former Soviet Union have never banned the party. I mean, Ukraine has the unfortunate distinction of having done that. And you also see kind of to me is sort of most disturbing is sort of autocracy or, demands for more sort of authoritarian controls emerging from below. I'm thinking here of the Mirotvorets efforts to sort of release names and addresses of journalists and the like, and these are sort of efforts to intimidate.
Why would you think this is authoritarian?
Because it basically meant to discourage certain kinds of journalism and criticism of the current government, and I think it's in other words, especially in democracy is always under threat during war. I mean, it's very easy for the government in power to treat any form of criticism as fundamentally treasonous, and you see that. I mean, you see that in my view. I mean, I'm an outsider, so that you see kind of some discourse that sort of because Putin is calling the Ukrainian government dysfunctional. If domestic forces call the Ukrainian government dysfunctional, they're somehow in league with Putin. So there's a sort of beginnings of treating criticism of the government as treasonous, and I think that's it's very troubling. I mean, it's understandable. I think almost all countries at war, historically have abrogated civil liberties. In the United States, of course, we had the very sad history of interning the Japanese, and that's something we don't want to repeat. So I think that's not necessarily unexpected, but nonetheless troubling. Competitive authoritarian regime isn't simply when you have elections and some kind of opposition. I mean, a competitive authoritarian regime exists when you have sort of real opposition. So in Russia today, it's not competitive authoritarian regime because all the opposition is essentially systemna, it's systemic opposition, as they call it there. They're not sort of they do not actually oppose Putin. They're just there kind of for show. Whereas in Ukraine, you obviously have a real opposition, and elections are truly uncertain. So there's a massive qualitative difference between a place like Azerbaijan, Russia, and obviously the other Central Asian countries, and Ukraine. And Ukraine is much closer to Moldova, which is, it's a borderline case of competitive authoritarianism. Nonetheless, I mean, I think the abuses are serious.
Because it's very easy to get into this kind of a discussion with the terms, and it's so easy to manipulate it with that today. So I'm curious, what are peculiarities of having this label on the nature of the regime? Because if we speak about the access to media, access to the resources, fair elections, because where this borderline, where you understand that a position is there, or some, for instance, like in case of Ukraine or Georgia, when you understand that in fact, there are independent media, but sometimes they don't have access. There are, other parties, but they are there unless they really have the majority in their municipalities, for instance. So, what for you would be this kind of landmark, benchmark?
So, one of the things I look for, and this was the case with Poroshenko and Saakashvili, is does the government regularly use the state to crack down, state institutions to crack down on opposition, in partisan ways, So, that there you have, that's a classic case when, Poroshenko, in principle, the decision on citizenship should not be based on whether or not you potentially could threaten the president in elections. It should be based on some sort of objective, impersonal criteria, and that clearly was not the case then. I think, similarly efforts to sort of investigate and use, a classic technique in competitive authoritarianism is the use of tax audits to target opposition. So in the old days, you'd simply ban opposition, right? That was sort of the old form of authoritarianism. Contemporary competitive authoritarianism, it's much more subtle and unclear. So you use tax audits against businesses who fund opposition or NGOs who are critical of the government. I mean, that's a classic. To me, that's a sort of definite red flag for, whenever I see that happening, I think, that's probably a competitive authoritarian.
Do you think in this regard, is Ukrainian oligarchy growing, shrinking, remaining the same? How it's transformed? What's transformation is going on?
I think, I don't have precise numbers on this, but my guess is that, much of the oligarchy really emerged in the mid-1990s with the gas market. The fact that you have fewer rents from Russia, I think sort of, reduces the access to those kind of oligarchic rents. So I think on the whole, my guess, I mean, again, I don't have numbers to prove this, is my guess you see a kind of, overall, you still have oligarchs, the country is still dominated by oligarchs, but not nearly to the same degree as it was, let's say, under Lazarenko in the 1990s or in the Crimea era in the early 2000s.
Coming back to the, developing democracy and establishing democracy, what are the critical things to maintain?
I think it basically comes down to, does the government use state institutions to punish opposition? That's basically the criteria. Do you use the security, the SBU, or the tax officials, or the regulatory bodies for media? Do you have, instead of having sort of objective and personal criteria, do you use those institutions to basically attack people who criticize the government? And I think, for me, the critical issue, for example, in my own home country of the United States, what I'm really looking at is, Trump right now is trying to politicize the FBI. He's trying to turn the FBI into a partisan arm of the Republican Party to attack opposition. I mean, he's making a very explicit effort to do this, and that to me, that's the tipping point. That's why I think it's, that's what you have to be on the lookout for, right? That the state institutions have to remain neutral to politics.
Where else the democratic conditionality could be enforced in post-Soviet world? Russia, Georgia, Azerbaijan, Moldova, Belarus. I'll ask about Central Asia. I'll ask about, you can go in details into different countries for instance.
I think democratic conditionality has historically been very successful in Moldova. I mean, you look at, because of the depends. I mean, I think Ukraine. I mean, I think, and maybe this isn't pleasant to hear, but I do think, it's in my view, appropriate for the United States to sort of demand sort of a democratic government, in exchange for aid and the like of Ukraine. I mean, I think that's just sort of, and I think that, we all share these values. But I actually want to step back a little bit from conditionality, because I actually think that overall, I first was active in Ukraine in the 1990s, and then there was this idea that, the West, the United States, is the teacher, Ukraine are the students, they sort of, and then it's about, the best practice in the West, transferring it to here. And I think what we've learned in the last, 2 years is that we are all in this together. And this is a common fight, right? And that, the West does not have all the answers, but it's a common fight for liberal democracy. And so, and I feel like, it's funny because I give in some lectures, and a lot of the questions I get are, fake news, post-truth kind of stuff. What do you do about Russian aggression? And I'm thinking to myself, wow, these are questions that are really important for my own country, and I'm trying to figure it out. And so rather than sort of saying like, oh, I have all the answers, here they are, do what I say, it's let's work on this together. And so in some ways, Ukraine is sort of on the forefront. I mean, I do think that Putin is really detrimental to the democratic world order, and I think that and Ukraine is sort of on the forefront. And I think part of it is sort of not treating it less as sort of the teacher-student, more as sort of we're part of the same liberal democratic team, and we have to work together to sort of save democracy.
For yourself, how would you explain this success of Putin in making that happen? What really happened with the Russian society?
Well, I don't know.
Or what he had done.
I guess I think you're framing the question wrong, because I think the whole issue is like, why did democracy fail in Russia? To me, is the wrong question. My research says, well, why should there have ever been democracy in Russia? Not because of the Russian soul but because, all sorts of sort of fundamental, access to oil, factors in political science that we consider, sort of prerequisites of stable autocracy, like oil, state control over the economy, a very powerful security apparatus, a very weak civil society.
And Thank you from the entire team of Hromadske International for watching. We are here to explain Ukraine and Eastern Europe. And I would encourage you to go to our webpage en.hromadske.ua, where you can find full version of all our interviews and reports. And follow us on Twitter and Facebook. Search Hromadske International. We are there working 24/7 for you. And with this, I say goodbye.